Imagine this. It's the year 1732, in a quiet Serbian village. A soldier named Arnold Paole has been dead for weeks, but villagers whisper that he has returned, haunting the living and drinking their blood. Terrified, the community begs the church for help. Soon, under the cold night sky, priests and villagers dig up his grave. What they find shocks them. Paole's body looks fresh, his skin ruddy, his mouth stained with blood. In a moment of desperation, a stake is driven through his chest and the corpse is burned. This isn't just folklore. This event was recorded in official documents, examined by military surgeons, and sanctioned by the Catholic Church. But why would the Church, the ultimate authority on sin, salvation, and the devil himself, be so afraid of a single corpse? For centuries, we've been told that the devil was Christianity's greatest enemy. But the truth is far stranger. In many ways, vampires terrified the Church even more than Satan, unlike the devil, who lived in the realm of doctrine and sermons. Vampires were seen as tangible, physical, and contagious. They rose from graves, attacked communities, and stirred panic the Church struggled to control. So tonight, let's dive deep into the dark history of vampires and ask a question few dare to consider. Did vampires scare the Church more than the devil himself? The Church always taught that the devil was the embodiment of evil. He was the tempter of souls, the enemy of God, the figure lurking behind every sin. His role was clear, his presence explained in sermons and scripture. Vampires, they were something else entirely. For peasants across Europe, the vampire wasn't an abstract force of temptation. It wasn't a spirit whispering in the night. It was your dead neighbour, your own relative, crawling out of the grave to feed on the living. Vampires were personal. They struck terror in small villages because they were familiar faces turned monstrous. In folklore, vampires went by many names. In Slavic regions, they were the Apir or the Strigoi. In Greece, they were called the Vrykalokas. No matter the name, the fear was the same, the restless dead rising to torment the living. These creatures weren't distant like Satan, they were intimate, physical, and horrifyingly close to home. This is where the clash began. The devil fit perfectly into church doctrine. Priests could warn against him, offer sacraments to protect against him, and claim authority over his influence. But vampires didn't follow the rules. They weren't a theological enemy. They were a folk enemy. And that made them dangerous, not just to the people, but to the Church's control. Imagine being a priest in the 14th century. You preach about sin, hell, and the devil. But your flock isn't worried about Satan. They're terrified of the dead. Man buried in the churchyard. Who might crawl back tonight? Which one do they fear more? The invisible devil, or the corpse they believe is clawing its way out of the soil? This tension, the devil as doctrine, the vampire as lived terror, is the heart of our story. And as we'll see, it's what made the vampire such a threat to the Church. The medieval Church's greatest weapon was fear of hell, fear of the devil, fear of sin. These fears kept the flock in line, guided their choices, and reinforced the Church's authority. But what happens when people are more afraid of something the Church doesn't fully control? That was the problem with vampires. Unlike demons or the devil, vampires came from local folklore, not church scripture. Villagers already had their own rituals to deal with them: garlic hung in doorways, iron nails driven into coffins, corpses buried face down so they couldn't rise. These were folk remedies, not Christian sacraments. For priests, this was a serious threat. If people turned to garlic and stakes instead of holy water and the cross, what did that say about the church's power? Vampires weren't just attacking the living. They were eroding the church's monopoly on fear and protection. The danger was real. There are recorded cases where villagers bypassed priests entirely, digging up graves on their own, staking and burning corpses without church approval. To the church, this was chaos people turning to superstition instead of sacred authority. In a world where obedience was survival, that was unacceptable. So, the church had to adapt. Sometimes priests denounced vampire beliefs as pagan lies, punishable by penance. Other times, they quietly joined in blessing the grave, sprinkling it with holy water, and even sanctioning the staking of suspected vampires. The message was clear: if vampires must be destroyed, the church will claim the right to destroy them. This uneasy dance between doctrine and folklore reveals just how much vampires unsettled the church. They weren't just monsters of the night. They were monsters that challenged the very foundation of religious authority. As vampire legends spread across Europe, the church could not simply ignore them. Too many villagers believed. Too many whispered stories circulated. Too many graves were disturbed. If the church remained silent, its authority would weaken. And so, in many cases, the church responded sometimes reluctantly, sometimes dramatically. One of the first ways the church attempted to combat vampire fears was through the consecration of graves. Priests would bless burial grounds, sprinkling them with holy water to prevent the dead from rising. This was a subtle way of asserting control. If a vampire was truly the restless damned, only the church could provide a cure. But things did not always remain subtle. In certain regions, priests went further, holding public ceremonies to rebury suspected vampires. Corpses were dug up, inspected, and then either staked or burned. Imagine the spectacle: villagers gathering in the dead of night, priests chanting prayers, torches lighting the graveyard as a coffin was pried open. Inside, the corpse might appear bloated, its mouth stained with what looked like blood. To frighten peasants, this was proof the dead had been feeding. To priests, it was an opportunity to show the church could still defeat evil. Documents from the 14th and 15th centuries describe these rituals in chilling detail. Some bodies had their heads severed and placed between their legs. Others were reburied with stones pressed into their mouths, preventing them from biting. These practices, which began as folk remedies, became sanctioned under the church's shadow. Yet, even as priests participated, there was unease. Vampire beliefs weren't part of official doctrine. They weren't written in scripture. And so the church often condemned the very practices it secretly performed. This contradiction reveals the depth of the problem. The church wanted to maintain spiritual authority, but the fear of vampires was too strong to dismiss. In the end, medieval responses to vampires were less about the creatures themselves and more about control. Every exhumation, every blessing, every ritual was a performance designed to remind villagers that in matters of life and death, only the church had the final word. By the 18th century, vampire hysteria reached its most explosive point. What began as scattered village tales in the middle, ages had grown into widespread panic. And nowhere was this more visible than in Eastern Europe. In regions of Serbia, Poland, and Austria, reports of the undead spread like wildfire. These were not just whispered legends. They became official cases investigated by military officers, physicians, and even the church. The fear often followed times of disease, outbreaks of plague, tuberculosis, and famine left villagers searching for explanations. When corpses were dug up and found to be unusually well preserved, with blood at the lips or a swollen appearance, the conclusion was terrifying. These were vampires feeding on the living. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1725 with Peter Plogojowitz, a man from Kisilova in Serbia. After his death, villagers claimed he returned at night, choking victims as they slept. 9 people died within days, and panic erupted. His grave was opened, and the body was found uncorrupted, with fresh blood around the mouth. The villagers, with the blessing of local priests, drove a stake through his heart and burned the remains. Another chilling case came just a few years later, in 1732 with Arnold Paole, a soldier who supposedly admitted in life that he had been attacked by a vampire. After his death, villagers reported seeing him roaming the night, feeding on neighbours. When officials exhumed his body, it was found looking disturbingly fresh, with blood seeping from the mouth. The authorities documented everything: the staking, the burning, and even the subsequent deaths of people believed to have turned into vampires themselves. These events shocked Europe. Reports of these exhumations were published widely, even discussed in royal courts and scientific circles. What disturbed the church most was how seriously these cases were taken outside its walls. The vampire panic was not just a peasant superstition anymore. It had reached the educated elite. Physicians argued whether vampire corpses were evidence of natural decay or proof of the supernatural. Governments sent soldiers to oversee vampire hunts. For the church, this was both an opportunity and a nightmare. On one hand, priests could step in, bless the graves, and lead the rituals. On the other, the spread of vampire panic showed that fear of the undead was surpassing even fear of the devil. The vampire epidemic had become a crisis of faith as much as a crisis of fear. For centuries, the devil had been Christianity's ultimate enemy, the fallen angel, tempter of humankind, the eternal adversary of God. But when vampire hysteria reached its height, many within the church began to frame these creatures as more than restless corpses. They were painted as direct manifestations of the devil's power. The logic was clear. The devil tempted the soul, but vampires corrupted both body and spirit. They defiled sacred ground by rising from their graves, mocked resurrection by returning in twisted form, and spread terror in a way that paralleled demonic possession. In sermons, some priests even called them servants of Satan, bodies hijacked by evil to torment the faithful. This connection to the devil gave vampires a theological foothold. The church could not deny their existence outright, because too many cases had been witnessed and too many corpses exhumed. Instead, it folded them into its worldview. If vampires were real, they were proof of the devil's presence in the world. But this also created a problem. Unlike Satan, who existed in the unseen world of temptation, vampires left physical evidence. blood on lips, bodies that refused to decay, graves disturbed. For villagers, this made them far more terrifying than the abstract devil preached from the pulpit. Even more troubling. Vampires blurred the line between the spiritual and the physical. Demons could be cast out with prayer. The devil could be resisted through penance and sacrament. But vampires required messy, earthly action staking, burning, mutilating corpses. These violent rituals looked closer to pagan magic than to Christian practice. Yet priests increasingly found themselves endorsing them. The church was caught between doctrine and necessity. In this way, the vampire became more than a monster. It became a mirror reflecting the church's own vulnerabilities. To call a vampire a servant of Satan was to admit that Satan's power could invade not just the soul, but the very flesh of the dead. And for believers, that was perhaps more frightening than the devil himself. By the end of the 18th century, the vampire panic began to fade. Advances in science offered new explanations for what villagers once believed were signs of the undead. Tuberculosis could make whole families waste away. Certain diseases caused corpses to bloat or bleed after death. Natural decomposition explained the proof people once took as vampirism. Slowly, reason began to replace superstition. But the legacy of those fears never disappeared. In fact, they shaped both religious practice and cultural imagination for centuries to come. Archaeologists have uncovered graves from Poland, Italy, and Greece where bodies were buried with bricks in their mouths, or pinned down with stones and iron rods, rituals meant to stop the dead from rising. Even when the church denounced such practices as superstition, they remained deeply ingrained in local communities. The vampire also left its mark on burial traditions. Graves were blessed more carefully. Coffins were sealed more tightly. Cemeteries became sacred spaces under stronger church oversight. In ways, the church's fear of vampires helped solidify its control over death itself. And while the hysteria faded, the vampire refused to die in imagination. By the 19th century, writers like John Polidori and later Bram Stoker transformed the vampire into a symbol of forbiddance desire, power, and eternal damnation. The vampire left the graveyard and entered literature, theatre, and eventually film. It became immortal not just in legend, but in culture. What's fascinating is how this shift mirrors the church's own struggle. The devil remained the timeless symbol of spiritual evil. But the vampire continued to embody something far more unsettling. The corruption of the familiar, the haunting of everyday life, the fear that the dead we bury might not stay buried. Even today, when we watch vampire films or read vampire novels, echoes of those churchyard exhumations and torchlit rituals linger, behind the romanticised fangs and gothic. Castle's lies an older truth that once upon a time, entire communities, priests and peasants alike, trembled at the thought that vampires might be more terrifying and more immediate than the devil himself. So, did vampires truly scare the church more than the devil? In many ways, yes. The devil was eternal, invisible, and theological powerful in doctrine, but distant in daily life. Vampires, on the other hand, were tangible. They rose from graves, stalked villages, and forced the church to act in ways that blurred the line. Between faith and superstition, the vampire became both a threat and a tool. a symbol of chaos that reminded the church of its own fragility. And even as science replaced superstition, the vampire never really died. It transformed, living on in stories, novels, films, and our imagination. But what do you think? Did vampires truly strike more fear into the church than the devil himself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into folklore and faith, make sure to check out my next video exploring the hidden demons in medieval art.